Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. I may have to start wearing even wider ties since we're going back to the 1970s, possibly even a leisure suit, powder blue, of course. Stacy.
Right, I know. I actually thought of wearing my poncho for this episode because you know how flower child thing was happening in the 70s, and of course, you and I remember the 70s during the oil embargo and then the Iranian Revolution, which caused price spikes in gasoline and shortages here across America, and we have them again. Max and I drove from Northern Virginia down to North Carolina, so about a 325-mile drive. And as we're heading further and further south, there are more and more gas stations without any gas. And those that did have gasoline had huge lines, sometimes miles long. So it was so weird in this time of pandemic and shortages and loads of things like microchips and in the beginning of the pandemic, of course, we had food shortages. Now we also have oversupply in money and in treasuries and bonds all over the place. That's why we have negative yielding bonds and stuff like that. So we have all sorts of price signals messed up and crazy times.
Oh, right. The crisis ends and the crisis begins. That's the way it used to be. Now there is just one crisis on top of another. You don't know where one starts and one stops, and it's just a multiple crises stacked up, right there in front of you. And you're thinking to yourself, my goodness gracious, what happened?
And when I was looking at all these lines at the gas stations that did have any gasoline available, I was thinking, in the 1970s, at least we had jobs to go to, like people were working and had to work for their money. We had stagflation just like we have now. But back then, there were no, there was very little welfare available. And in fact, remember when New York City went broke, what did Ford say to New York City? Drop dead, said go broke. Now nobody's allowed to go broke. So there's all this money. Of course, also there are anti-gouging laws. So even though people were showing up with canisters all over the place, filling up tanks, huge tanks filled with gasoline, the price signal was saying, do it, go for it. It's cheap because you're about to have total shortage.
Right, so this price signal is an important fact to wrap our minds around. And how do empires collapse? How do countries collapse? And we saw a fantastic collapse with the Soviet Union. And they had a similar situation where it wasn't about the price signal of money failing. It was about the price signal of manufacturing failing. In other words, they were keen on putting out a certain number of farm equipment and tractors, no matter what the cost. They had no accounting for it. They just wanted this raw number of farm equipment, and that was a metric that they used. Like we generated X number of 100,000 tractors. And there's no price signals, so it collapsed. Here in the United States, the money itself is not driven by any kind of a price signal. It's the Politburo, called the Federal Open Market Committee, and they fix prices, or they rig prices, or they control prices, price control for the dollar. And so all price signals, like in the Soviet Union, have gone nuts. And similarly, like the Soviet Union, the United States is now collapsing.
Of course, we're comparing it to the 1970s when we also had shortages due to conflict happening in the Middle East. We're having conflict now, but that doesn't impact anything. And these price signals, back in the 1970s, we saw huge inflation, but we also saw interest rates soaring, right? So Zero Hedge points out that the last time core CPI was here, the Fed funds rate was 20%. The core CPI numbers came in and it's over 4%, but they're like, if you exclude food and energy, it's only 3%. Of course, there is that base problem where it's comparing it to last year during the middle of the beginning of the pandemic. So they're saying that's why it's higher than it is. But again, because they distort price signals, and the price signal at the gasoline station, for example, is telling you that there's no problem, no shortages, plenty of supply, $2.85. It's only up 4 cents since the knockout of the pipeline happened. And that whole disintegration, we've been talking about the disintegration and the deglobalization and the entropy that happens in a system like the US dollar, which turns 50 this year, or the US empire, which maybe turns 65, 70 this year. And what you're seeing is with this, the pipeline being taken out, I mean, it's hard to get real information about it, but what it seems like is like people are saying this shouldn't be able to happen. Like that the fact that one pipeline provides 45% of the gasoline to the entire East Coast of America, but that they could be taken offline by some sort of hack or pressing an email, the wrong link or something.
Right. Well, having a lack of diversity and competition in the oil business is the result of mergers and acquisitions and the monopolization or oligopolization of the U.S. economy, thanks to cheap money and private equity and no regulators and no respect of competition or free market enterprise. Now, going back to the 1970s, yes, interest rates went up to 20% and the bond market crashed because the price signal told the central bank at the time under Paul Volcker that thanks to Richard Nixon's money printing and default on the US dollar in the 1970s and the problems associated with the cost of the Vietnam War, that had to be wrung out of the system. There was too much fiat money, had to be wrung out of the system. So at that time in the 70s, America was not scared and hiding under the bed about the fact that they would have to actually work for a living and be productive in some way. Unlike today, where people are not working, they fear the work has become a four-letter word in America.
Well, again, it's the price signal, because as we've covered, and many in the media have been covering the fact that, with government transfers, if you're staying at home and not working out and on enhanced unemployment benefits, you're making over $16 an hour. And that is a problem. We saw that on this drive up to North Virginia and back, as we saw help wanted signs everywhere, literally everywhere, even in abandoned fields of where used to be agricultural fields along the rivers. You saw signs like delivery driver needed urgent. And that brings me to the other problem with what is happening with the gasoline, is that apparently there's also, CNN was already warning, for example, before this pipeline shutdown, and that was that there would be shortages of gasoline at gas stations because there's a huge shortage of delivery drivers, because it's a very specialized field that to be able to drive a tanker filled with fuel. So the pandemic shut down the schools that trained the younger ones coming online, but there's also new regulations that were brought in January of 2020, whereby if you've had any sort of drug or alcohol-related conviction, you're not allowed to drive. So that kicked off between 40 and 60,000 people that wanted to be delivery drivers, but they can't be because of these past records. So there is it's a general entropy and disintegration, right? It's like everything. It's not one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong.
Right. Well, the problem with billionaires is not that they, by some, don't pay enough taxes. The problem is that they got to be billionaires by hollowing out the economy, by destroying the infrastructure, by stealing from pension accounts, from destroying the moral fabric of the country. People like Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates, et cetera, they did so, they achieved their wealth at the expense of the common good. They literally threw the country under the bus. And now we're dealing with the consequences of, really, it started with Reagan and Thatcher and the deregulation, and the central banks became activist under Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, and now Jay Powell, where they do the bidding of the oligarchs. And America has a very nasty oligarch problem, and we need a leader that can deal with the oligarchs. Clearly, the current policy leadership in Washington has no way to deal with oligarchy in America. That's sad.
So going back to the 1970s and comparing the situation to then, we're 50 years since the U.S. dollar began a global reserve fiat standard in 1971 when Nixon took us off the gold window. So full circle, like we started this year saying the U.S. dollar turns 50. Is it going to make this year? And of course, the entropy sets in. The entropy sets in the human being. When you turn 50, things start going wrong. It takes you longer to recover from certain things. The same thing, I believe, is happening. And you can see this in another zero hedge headline, and that is Rabobank. Richard Nixon was the last U.S. president to face a major economic crisis involving soaring inflation and gasoline and supply chains and the Middle East and the superpower rivalry and the U.S. dollar itself. So you're starting to see all the cycle turn, the fourth turning, all the stuff, the entropy is setting in, the disintegration is happening. And I might say, again, on the drive, you could do it yourself. Anybody could go do the drive if you could find some gasoline. And what you'll see is, bizarrely, which I had not been expecting, is the Trump 2024 bumper stickers and yard signs all over the place. I was a little bit surprised to see that because I hadn't really read about it.
You know, the 70s also featured disco and an abandonment of the rock and roll era, which was a net benefit, I think, to some degree, because we had to endure what's called progressive rock, and we fortunately came to the Church of Iggy Pop, who punked us out of the Nixon malaise. So we need a new Iggy Pop, or bring back Iggy Pop. I just saw him on YouTube with a parrot singing some song. That's what we need. We need Iggy Pop back.
Well, we have better than Iggy Pop. We have Bitcoin, and that's in the news because we've also been covering Stan Druckenmiller, who's been pretty active warning about this. Like, he started back at the end of the summer when all the money printing was becoming quite apparent, and he was expressing his concern, and it was telling everybody, and we told you that he was saying that he's very, very, very short the US dollar, and he's even further short the US dollar. He actually was on CNBC this week, and he said that he doesn't think the US dollar as a reserve currency will survive for another 15 years. So again, that's sounding like us. He's one of the most legendary of hedge fund managers in the world, was part of the Soros Quantum Fund when they shorted the pound and forced them out of the exchange rate mechanism. He also said, Stan Druckenmiller, 5 years ago, I said crypto was a solution in search of a problem. Well, now the problem has been clearly identified. It's Jerome Powell and the rest of the world's central bankers. There's a lack of trust. But you can trust Keiser Report. We've been telling you all this time, like, he didn't see it 5 years ago. We told you 5 years ago. Now he's saying, yes, Stacy and Max are right. 5 years ago, this is causing, all the money printing is causing.
For 10 years. And we said the problem was central banks.
Yes, we did.
For 10 years.
Yes.
So Stan Druckenmiller is like, oh, finally, I figured it out. You know, had you been doing what we have been doing, Stan, your performance would have been 1,000 times better. You wouldn't be losing money like Ray Dalio.
So back in the 70s, when we were talking about when this all began, then we had Paul Volcker, who is the one that took interest rates up to 80%.
Make Iggy Pop head of the central bank.
He's the new Paul Volcker.
Okay, he could be the new Paul Volcker. Look, Bitcoin is the solution for all problems. I see there's a lot of kerfuffle in the Mideast again. You know, everyone was on a Bitcoin standard, peace and love would break out, and we could finally get over this craziness. But, you know, everyone will learn in their own time, and they'll pay what they deserve for Bitcoin. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to a very special guest, the inimitable David Morgan of the Morgan Report. David, welcome back.
Max, it's been a little too long. Thanks for having me back.
Right. I'm just figuring out which one of us is getting more gray hair. I think you might be winning that race, but I'm a close second. Now, let's move on. David, I got to ask you, are you having flashbacks of the 1970s? Gasoline shortages, everybody unemployed. What next?
Very much so. It does remind me of the oil crunch. I lived through it. I was pretty young in those days, and you filled up based on your license plate. If it ended with an even or an odd number, a lot of tension in the air, a lot of uncertainty, and we're back at the same place, only it's on a global scale. I know it's just U.S. based primarily, but it's worldwide based on a lot of things, primarily the reserve currency being the dollar, and of course, it's been off quite a bit with what's going on in the crypto world that you're much more familiar with than me, and the people that refuse to use the dollar in international commerce and have circumvented the SWIFT system. So lots of things playing out this time that didn't exist the last time we faced this kind of a crisis.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of things that were not present back then are going to be adding to the dimension of this particular period. As you point out, the U.S. dollar, of course, world's reserve currency, and that seems to be spreading this 1970s-like stagflation and everything associated with it to a global basis. We're at a 50-year anniversary of the dollar. People like Stan Druckenmiller and others don't think the dollar is even going to get to August and even get to the 50-year anniversary. This is all coming together in a kind of a convergence of disaster. And, you do mention the US dollar there, and there is a global rejection, seemingly, of the US dollar. And there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. How do you approach that?
Well, it's probably been overstated, Max, but I approach it based on the debt bomb. It's all confidence. It's a complete con game. If you don't trust a dollar, 6 months out, why would you buy a 30-year treasury? So it's this back and forth yield curve, yield adjustment. It's a way that they can financialize everything and make people continue to play the bond market basically on a trading vehicle basis rather than on an investment basis. It's starting to wear thin, as you well know, and I think we don't have a lot longer. I certainly wouldn't put myself in the same category as Stan Druckenmiller, but I would say August seems a little early. I certainly wouldn't rule it out, but we're seeing the last vestige of hope with the central bankers to push this fiat currency any further, and that's why you see the competing currency meme so strong with Bitcoin and the other cryptos. People are looking for a way out. Very typical the end of a fiat experiment.
Yeah, it's kind of sad because you, myself, and others have been talking about some things like how the U.S. economy's gotten hollowed out. 0% interest rates. Remember, back in the 70s, it was illegal for companies to do stock buybacks for obvious reasons. It's rank stock manipulation. And yet, starting in the 80s, starting with Reagan and the deregulation, that became legal. And companies don't manufacture anymore. They don't hire decent wages anymore. They buy back their own stock to manipulate their own stock so that the executives can make hundreds of billions of dollars. And so the economy in the country, if you look at the infrastructure fails, the roads and bridges are failing, the gas is unavailable. It's been hollowed out. I mean, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say we're entering a similar moment as the Soviet Union did when it collapsed. I think it's for the similar reasons. It's just the economy is much too fragile. The leadership is essentially an oligarchy at this point. There's no democratic rule of law. Is that too far of a stretch?
No, it sounds very doomy gloomy, but I have to say, I think you're doing a reasoned response to the real situation. And the only thing I could add further, Max, and you did a great job, is Glass-Steagall. I mean, if we had that intact, where commercial banks lent to farmers and builders, built out infrastructure, and you didn't have to play Russian roulette with the investment markets, we might have a stronger economy. But once under the Clinton administration, I'm bipartisan, I hate all politicians equally, but I think that we'd have a different economy. But once everyone started playing this investment banking game, whether they wanted to or not, it distorted the misallocation of capital that we talked about in the movie we're in together so many years ago. And it's continued to go down that trail. And I think we're getting out of road. I think, kicking the can down the road, I think we hit the end.
Right. Of course, at the end of the 1970s, at the end of a stagflationary period, Paul Volcker jacked rates up, the bond market collapsed. And that was probably the last time you had true price discovery in a major market in America. Because starting in the 1980s, and particularly after the crash of 87, where Greenspan, Robert Rubin, and Reagan interceded and started to buy stocks for the house account in Washington, D.C., you haven't had price discovery. It's been price fixing. It's been the price of money itself, or interest rates. It's a Politburo of bureaucrats in Washington that establishes those rates. And now, 40 years later, it's predictably a predictable collapse because we haven't had free market capitalism in 35, 40 years in America. It's been an oligarchy, and the oligarchies, these billionaires, they didn't do it because they're smart. They did it because they stole it. Warren Buffett's got to be probably the guy who's transferred more wealth to him personally, using accounting fraud and market manipulation than anyone in history, right? He's never invented anything. He's never done anything productive. He's only been on the receiving end of major oligarchic fraud in America. And now it's the chickens are coming home to roost, and he'll be gone. Him and Charlie will be in the they'll be gone soon. And what did they leave behind? But it's an enormous garbage of a mess. It's disgusting.
I love your guts and your honesty and your straightforwardness, Max. I always have. And I really can't add on to it except that to say, we've got to have the right attitude. We have to accept those facts you just outlined and understand the consequences of that. There's a law, it's a law of, you have to read the repercussions of what you've sown. We've sown bad seed for a long time. We faked it. We phonied it. We are under an oligarch control, and now we're going to have to pay the price on a societal basis. And the more you are able to understand that, the better you're able to cope. Because at this point, there's really no way out. People have asked me, well, what do we do? And I say, you got to wait for it to bottom. I think we're not going to be steep down the hill, crash to the, bottom. But, that possibility exists. I don't want to be too gloomy here, Max, but the point being what's going on there, North Carolina, where you are with this pipeline situation, these complex societies have problems that compound. When the oil doesn't flow, then the transportation isn't the same, and then people start hoarding. Then you get more fear in the system, and then they start thinking, well, maybe what's the next thing to be short of? And these things have a way of, let's say, exploding exponentially before you know it.
Yeah, I'm watching the Fed here under Jay Powell, and they've increased the money supply in the last year or so. In terms of the entire history of money supply in America, they've increased it by 25% or so just in the last year. So I got to believe that they know kind of what they're doing. It's like one of those teen movies where the teenagers find the parents' liquor cabinet, and they decide to go crazy for the weekend. They know they're going to get in trouble, but they do it anyway. So I think the Fed knows that these are the last days of disco, that the party is over. And Jay Powell is just like, before it collapses, I'm just going to do one last super multi-$100 billion injection to my friends. Am I being cynical, or is he simply just, before he retires and starts working for Jeff Bezos or starts working for one of these guys, or Citadel Capital, where, of course, Ben Bernanke is, and he oversaw the GameStop fiasco, if not engineered it, right? Is he just doing a one last push to get that big job once he leaves the Fed, the central bank, David?
I guess the most truthful answer I can give you, Max, is I don't know, but I certainly agree with your metaphor, your analogy. I think it's extremely accurate. There is no exact point with most mainstream economists what's hyperinflation. Most of us give it a rule of thumb of about 20%. When you've increased the money supply 25%, as you so eloquently said, we know we are in dire straits. We know we're at the end of the game, and yet they'll have the, let's say, guts to get on nationwide TV and say, if inflation starts to rear its ugly head, we have the tools to put it back in a box, which is ludicrous. There's absolutely no way. So I'm looking for a stagflationary depression. Some things will be going up, like everything we need, like food and energy, housing, and everything we don't need, like the third big screen TV that's, 100 inches by 200 or whatever this nonsense goes with the, iPhone 27.2. A lot of that stuff's it's going to be here, but a lot of stuff that we don't necessarily need to survive probably will come down in price, which you could say is deflationary, but the stuff we really need to live, it's going to continue to go higher.
Right. So, David, for a long time, we've been told inflation's 1.6%. Just got some data. Now they're saying, oh, it's 4.6%. That still seems way understated, David Morgan.
Well, I've been adherent to John Williams, and I try to seek truth in all aspects of my life. And John calculates the inflation rates based on how the calculation was done in 1980. If you use those metrics and you use food and energy, the two things people need the most, you have about a 9.7% inflation rate right now. And if I could be so bold to move on a little bit further, I just answered this question for one of my members. He said, well, I'm worried about this inflation thing, and I know it's good for the metals, but then higher interest rates push the gold price down. I said, it's pretty simple to answer. You have to look at what is the true inflation rate and what's the interest rate, and look at those terms. So what I'm saying is, you have nothing to fear with an interest rate to about 9%, because that's the true inflation rate. When Volcker came in, interest rates by the CPI, which was accurate in 1980, was 13%. You pushed interest rates up to 20%, which gave you a delta of 7% real yield. That killed the gold market, helped the bond, crushed the bond market, but put the country back on track. And the best investment you could make for the last 40 years was the long bond. Those days are over. And the point I'm making, and you can reemphasize it, Max, is that you can't do that again. We don't have the margin to do it. You put interest rates up to probably 4 or 5%. The interest that's owed on the national debt would be so astronomical, you couldn't even make the interest payments.
All right, we're going to have to cut it there and carry it over to a second segment. David, thanks for being on Keiser Report.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report. With me, Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, David Morgan of the Morgan Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.